So we're continuing our look at defining the research problem. In previous videos, we've talked about recognizing the problem or opportunity. So we're looking at digging deeper to figure out what the true underlying issue is that we want to address. And that can be helped by finding out why the information is being sought, so some context around it, what decisions we made based on it, to make sure that the data we collect truly does lead to decisions being able to be made and to be informed decisions. So that brought us to the third here, which is understanding the decision-making environment. And we talked about some exploratory data analysis or some situational analysis that can be used to help understand and brainstorm what might be going on. In this video, let's look at using the symptoms to clarify the problem. And so I'm just going to scroll. We are now at bullet number 4. So we need to be able to distinguish between symptoms and a problem. What is the underlying problem we're trying to get at? So let's suppose the symptoms are that the market share has shrunk from 60% to 40%. That's what we're seeing. Okay, well, when we talk about the problem and clarifying the research problem, we need to really get at the underlying issue here. Perhaps we've had a change in the organization, in what they do, in their products, in which case that's what we need to be looking at. Is it about the competition? Is that what we need to be looking at? So what are the objectives of the organization? What has changed in the last while that could be related to these symptoms? So what is it we're actually monitoring? What are the actual objectives that the organization has? Now, remember here, the negative symptoms can indicate a problem, but they can also create opportunities. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that negative symptoms, bad things are happening where our company is struggling. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a problem we're trying to resolve. It could be that there are a whole new positive opportunities that are coming from that. So really we need to get at what is causing the symptoms to help us clarify the direction and focus of our research project. So let's go back to one we very briefly discussed in a previous video, but you are Coca-Cola, okay? Coca-Cola is losing market share to Pepsi. And we talked before, when we talked about clarifying the problem and the context around it, really the underlying issue there was they were thinking about changing the recipe for Coke, classic Coke, to make it sweeter, to be more like Pepsi. So we need to clarify, what is it the client really wants to know? Does Coke just want to know why they are losing taste tests, for example? So I'm just going to show, there were a lot of commercials, advertisements like this coming from Pepsi. So this one is one coming out of...
John here says that he prefers the leading cola to Pepsi.
Right.
I want you to taste both colas, John, and tell me which taste you...
So he tastes the two drinks. One of them's Pepsi, one of them's Coke. And we find here that people were preferring Pepsi in blind taste tests. You can see here it's saying the taste test across Australia, over 50% of people preferred the taste of Pepsi over Coke. And so Coke was seeing this, right? They're seeing all these advertisements. They're hearing about these taste tests, and people just seem to like the taste of Pepsi better. So the symptoms they're seeing is that their market share is falling, and people in these taste tests seem to like Pepsi better. So we get to the question, what is the underlying research problem we want to address here? Does Coke just want to know why they are losing taste tests? But taste tests itself are just a symptom. It's something we can observe, but it's not the underlying question or problem. So we're digging deeper with Coke to identify what is it they really want to know and what are they going to do with that information, right? So again, what they were really trying to figure out is whether or not to change the recipe for classic Coke in order to have it taste a bit more like Pepsi, because it seemed like they were losing to Pepsi and people liked that taste of Pepsi better. So the question they were asking though is, why are we losing taste tests, not what would happen if we changed the recipe for Coke. And as we talked about in a previous video, of course, the challenge is that people have a nostalgic attachment to Coke. So while the sales of Coke were lower, it goes even lower if you change the ingredients to something that people no longer have that historical attachment to. So the challenge is, if you don't have that research project focused in the right direction that's truly related to what the company is thinking about, is going to lead them in the wrong direction, right? Like changing the recipe for Coke. All right, so what do? All right, so we need to distinguish between the symptoms and the real thing. So we need to know, is it a symptom we're looking at, something we can observe, or is that the underlying problem or opportunity they really want to focus on? Just because it's negative symptoms doesn't mean that the underlying issue is negative. Now, we need to recognize the iceberg principle. The iceberg principle says that, okay, imagine an iceberg. And if you think about an iceberg, you only see a small tip of the iceberg above the water. Everything else is hidden. So only about 10% of the iceberg is actually visible. So we only actually see some of the symptoms. And that means that whoever's making these decisions for the organization, the person hiring the researcher or the management that you're doing this research for, they can fail to see the deeper problem because they don't see the whole picture. They just see the iceberg. And so they tend to get a bit of tunnel vision and get focused on that tip of the iceberg, whether it's the failing the Coke Pepsi challenges or it's the market share, and they become fixated on that issue and not considering the bigger what's happening, bigger picture. And so your role when you are helping people do research projects is to get them to flesh out for you the bigger picture so that you can really get to the heart of the issue and not get stuck in that silo. So we want to help them identify the true problem. The good way to do this is that if you are meeting with someone who's asking for research projects, is to keep asking them, well, then why did this happen? They're saying, here's the issue. The issue is we're losing these taste tests. Well, why do you think that's happening? We think that's happening because Pepsi tastes sweeter. Well, why do you think it is that customers want sweeter drinks? If you keep getting them to tell you why they think this is happening and you kind of chase them down that line of thought, you can get to what they're really focused on. And so when Coke comes to the researcher and says, well, we're losing these taste tests, how do we get more market share? One, that's very broad. And two, you don't know that really what they're trying to think about is whether or not to change the recipe. Well, if you start to ask them about why they think that we're losing the taste tests, and they say, well, it's because it's sweeter. And no, why does this matter? What do you think happens because of this? Why did this happen? You'll start to get towards what you should really be focusing on, right? And what we could find here is that perhaps that there is a different target market between Coke and Pepsi. Coke is something that's been around for longer, so it tends to be more popular in older generations. Pepsi, we start to look at in the early 90s, picking up favorability, like with those commercials that we just showed. And it's more popular among young people. So young people tend to favor sweeter things. So it's about the demographics and a demographic switch. As there's more young people, then Pepsi will lead. When there's less young people, then the preference might be to Coke. So perhaps we need to have something that caters to the younger people and something that caters to the older people. So it's not about changing the Coke recipe, but it's about two different product lines to two different distinct groups. So one of the reasons you're digging deeper about why do they think this happened, what is going on, is to, when you do your research, it's very different research if you're trying to figure out two different products to two different target markets versus changing the recipe for everybody, right? Those are different research questions that we're asking. Okay, so we're trying to dig deeper and get to the rest of the iceberg, and to take that information, and we're still trying to turn it into a research project. And so in our next video, we're going to look at how do you translate all that information, all that context that you've just collected, into something that can actually be researched. So our step number 5 is going to be to translate all of that management issues into a research project.